2023 was quite a year, not just for me and my channel, but also in general. It was also a big year for Hollywood, both in terms of labor disputes and the stuff that got to theaters. And there were plenty of fantastic movies this year. There were movies that pushed boundaries, told unforgettable stories, and achieved incredible feats in their own right. Unfortunately, that is not what I'll be talking about in this video. Rather, I'll be going over 10 of the absolute worst pieces of cinematic manure to grace the silver screen in 2023. While some of the movies I saw this year were just regular, run-of-the-mill bad, others went above and beyond to deliver some truly abysmal experiences, and I'll be highlighting some of the worst in that regard. Of course, this list is based on my humble and purely subjective opinions, but I'll also be limiting it to only the films I've seen from opening logos to ending credits. So unfortunately, the likes of Ghosted, Heart of Stone, and The Exorcist Believer won't be included. Everything else is fair game. With that said, these are my top 10 worst movies of 2023.
We do a little trolling. It's called We Do a Little Trolling.
I don't know about you, but I for one cannot stand the Trolls movies. They may be well animated and they may have some decent enough song covers, but all of that is wasted on the terrible writing, loathsome characters, and painful humor. And the same applies to the third installment, Band Together. Maybe not to as egregious of an extent as the first two, but it's still pretty bad. Like the first two movies, however, the writing is still an absolute disaster here. It feels like it has no idea what to do with itself and just jumps from plot point to plot point without any cohesive pacing, being held together by terrible jokes and even worse characters, especially John Dory. At least for once, Poppy isn't the worst character in one of these movies, though. And the main plotline where Branch and company have to rescue his brother isn't the slightest bit interesting, with all the standard tropes we've grown accustomed to in these sort of animated kids films, including two long-lost family members, in addition to the villains being really unremarkable. One of them is voiced by Amy Schumer, which kinda makes sense since James Corden was absent from this one, and I guess Universal needed another one of the worst actors out there to fill in for him. Maybe this could be seen as a sort of monkey's paw situation, I don't know. And what's worse, despite how broken down this movie is, this is only number 10. Yeah, I didn't really think Trolls Band Together was bad enough to warrant a lower ranking since the animation was beautiful and the songs, especially Better Place, were really good. It just sucks that those few good elements were all but wasted on how terrible everything else was. I'm sure Universal and DreamWorks are probably going to continue to milk this franchise for whatever it's worth in the near-distant future, but while I wouldn't consider Band Together the worst Trolls movie, it's still further proof that Trolls is the worst property to have the DreamWorks name attached to it. Let's just hope we can all be civil about this in the comments section, okay?
India? Wait, do you mean like Indiana?
The best way I can describe Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is that it's like a fart. At first, I certainly wasn't all that happy with it, but I figured, hey, it could have been worse. But then as it started to linger, boy did it get so much worse than I was expecting. Yes, that probably wasn't the most mature comparison I could have used, but the point is, Dial of Destiny sucks, okay? Like another franchise Disney acquired from Lucasfilm, this movie tries to undo the events of the previous, somewhat more divisive entry, but fails to do anything that would justify its existence. Sure, I'm not the biggest fan of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, but at least I can say that it gave Indy a happy ending. Here, though, he gets next to nothing worthwhile in terms of character development. Now he's just a surly old man tagging along with this random girl to go get an artifact before some former Nazis do. And speaking of which, the new characters they add don't feel like worthy additions to the Indiana Jones universe, especially Helena. You know what, Jake's Cartoons, you're right. I'm surprised I didn't originally bring up just how much she sucks as a character. She's got this annoyingly smug and condescending personality where she always feels like she's trying to one-up Indy, who himself underwent a fair deal of character assassination here by having essentially neglected her existence up until now. Did the writers forget about his whole thing with his father in Last Crusade or something? So I can't root for either of the leads, not to mention the villains are boring and mostly only show up when the story requires them to. But what about the adventure itself? It's not all that good either. It's very formulaic and contrived, full of stale references to the franchise's past, and the pacing really makes the almost 2.5-hour runtime apparent. Not only that, but this movie introduces time travel into the Indiana Jones universe. You thought the aliens in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull were ridiculous? Dial of Destiny has Indy, Helena, and the Nazis fly a plane through a portal back to the Siege of Syracuse before Indy meets Archimedes himself. And it's so utterly insane that it's honestly kinda entertaining. At least it was able to hold my attention unlike the majority of the movie, and I will admit, the first 15 or so minutes did a decent enough job harkening back to the feel of the original trilogy. The CGI looked nice for the most part, John Williams' score was pretty good, and I could tell Harrison Ford was trying his best with the materials he was given. But despite all that, Dial of Destiny is easily the worst entry in the Indiana Jones pentology and a depressing send-off to one of the most legendary characters in Hollywood. It's sadly not surprising that Disney went ahead with this, but Disney gonna do what Disney gonna do, I suppose.
You take the moon, and you take the moon, and you take the moon, and you take the moon.
Netflix didn't have an easy year in 2023. Like, sure, they turned out a few gems here and there, but other than that, there was a lot of crap that hit the service. Take, for instance, A Child of Fire, the first part of Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon saga. If you've seen any sci-fi space operas from the last 40 or 50 years, you've seen this one. It's very telling that this was a rejected Star Wars script, as it's basically just A New Hope without any of the intrigue or nuance. The characters are blank slates with nothing defining about them, the world building is unremarkable, the pacing is tediously slow, and the presentation reeks of executive interference. Apparently Snyder is already working on a 4-hour director's cut to fill in for this movie's gaping plot holes, but if anything, that just shows that neither he nor Netflix had a clear vision behind this franchise and that they were only trying to ride off the success of more popular properties. I will give it, however, that visually speaking it does look really good. There's some great CGI and gorgeous cinematography, even if the fight scenes have way too much unnecessary slow-mo. But while a good script can save bad visuals, good visuals cannot save a bad script. It sucks too, because it's cool to see Zack Snyder wanting to branch out and make new stories after his tenure with DC. But sadly, the big new franchise he decided to go with is something we've already seen a bunch of times before, and I doubt Part 2 will be much better either.
So everybody starts kung fu fighting. Those kicks were fast as lightning.
Journey to the West is one of the most famous stories in Chinese mythology. It's been the subject of plenty of adaptations as well, and given how it's been becoming more popular for animated movies to showcase Chinese culture in recent years, Netflix decided to have a shot at adapting this legendary fable with The Monkey King. Although this is only number 7 on the list, this was probably one of the most frustrating experiences I had watching a movie in 2023. If it wasn't for the good animation and exciting action scenes, this would certainly be at a much lower placement. And that mainly boils down to the title character himself. I'm not being the slightest bit hyperbolic when I say that Monkey King is one of the most loathsome, obnoxious, and insufferable characters in all of fiction. He's certainly in my top 10. Like, it's not impossible to make viewers root for an unlikable main character. The same can be said about characters who start out as jerks, but who become selfless heroes in the end. Monkey King, however, is neither. Throughout the entire movie, he's an annoyingly smug, impulsive, and self-righteous narcissist who constantly condescends those around him and doesn't seem to make any iota of effort to, I don't know, not make me want to punch him in his stupid face? And this is the biggest problem I have with the Monkey King. The main character we're supposed to be rooting for is such a douchebag that it gives the movie a disgustingly mean-spirited tone and it makes the whole experience feel agonizing to sit through. But like I said, the reason this isn't any lower is because the action scenes are pretty good. They have some great choreography, the animation is fast-paced and energetic, and it has some decent use of thrash metal in the soundtrack. Sadly, that does little to redeem just how painful of an experience it is watching this movie, and since we're still not too far into the list, maybe that should give you an idea of the kind of garbage I put myself through.
Shut up, Meg.
Why does Meg 2 The Trench exist? The first Meg movie from 2018 is something I don't think anyone remembers, let alone was asking for a sequel to. But Warner Brothers decided to do it anyway to squeeze some extra money out of the Chinese box office because Lord knows they need that money right now. And the result is something that may have narrowly avoided the bottom 5, but believe me, it's still terrible. For one, you'd expect that this movie would focus on the giant prehistoric shark shown off in the advertising, right? Wrong. Instead, a sizable amount of the runtime is spent on these weird lizard creatures who do next to nothing to enhance the narrative of the movie. Speaking of said narrative, the writing in Meg 2 felt like it was having some sort of identity crisis. One minute it's a monster thriller, then it's a family drama with Jason Statham and some girl who tags along with him on an underwater expedition, then it's a spy heist featuring the average villains in an episode of Captain Planet, and then it just gives up and does whatever it feels like doing. And to top it all off, this movie is boring as hell. There's a lot of scenes of hardly anything interesting happening, and the stuff we do get is loaded with terrible dialogue and unfunny jokes. I mean, I'll give it that it has some nice looking CGI and the score was pretty good, but like I said, good visuals can't save a bad script, and that's why I had to include Meg 2 on the list. Maybe not to the extent of it being in the bottom 5, but certainly to the extent of it being here anyway.